Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Destroyer called Ken. It's hard to talk about Dan Bejar's work with Destroyer, not just for its sheer diversity of tones and sounds that have flipped through a dozen different genres over the decades, but also because getting a grip on his writing, well, most people don't, critics included. Hell, even with every single listen to his albums, I don't quite feel like I always get his turns of phrase, and I've struggled to articulate why that even is. Hell, even on songs where he does get more direct, and there have been less and less of those with his work in the 2010s, the implications, the subtext, the tone of his work often lingers longer for me than the actual text. Sometimes picking up enough of a foundation, like in the cinematic swell and grounded themes of Poison Season, which is one of the best records of 2015 for the record. But other times, okay, look, I like Kaput, but that album can get lost in its own slick 80s inspired sophistopop atmosphere, and I have to find myself going back more to the grounded but still potent records like Thief or Street Hawk of Seduction, or my personal favorite, the melodically stunning Your Blues. But one tone I've always felt can be kind of hit or miss for Dan Bejar compositionally is instability, mostly because I've always found him most compelling at his most refined and composed and measured and emotionally expressive, where you can tell the structure reinforces and propels the emotional transcendence that his most poetic lines and delivery can get to. Without that structure, you get records like Trouble in Dreams and This Night, which are frequently compelling in snippets, but kind of messy in a way that gives you the suspicious feeling that Dan Bejar might be trolling his audience. He's self-aware enough, he knows his style, he could pull that off. And even if he swears that he's not, it's not exactly a feeling that goes away. Such was my concern with Ken, which was reportedly scaling back from the grandiose, earnest power of Poison Season for something a little smaller and murkier and sleazier, with chill tones playing for Noir, but potentially tilting for over-stylized but conceptually underweight kitsch. In other words, the buzz from the music press going in was not exactly as promising as I was hoping. But you know what, I wanted to dig into this for myself. Dan Bejar is too good of a songwriter and too innovative of a composer for me not to give this a full chance. So, what did I find on Ken? Okay, this is not what I was expecting. And it's one of those odd cases where I think much of the reviews and conversation about this album have not only kind of missed the point, but also somewhat mischaracterized this album, especially when you start digging into the themes and the content. But I also can't really blame those critics. While Ken is easily the most direct that Destroyer has been in some time, the tone of the writing and the composition seems to come from a place midway between the National Sleep Well Beast, David Bowie's Black Star, Nick Cave and the Bad Seasons, Higgs Boson Blues, early to mid-80s records from The Cure, and, funnily enough, the New Pornographer's newest album, Whiteout Conditions, a project that Dan Bejar couldn't work on because of this Destroyer album. Amusing how much they seem to fall into a similar headspace, and while I don't quite think that Dan Bejar quite matches the brilliance of We've Been Here Before on any one track off of Ken, overall, this is a more bleak and potent listen. And when I say that, I mean that it's one of the best records of 2017. And the most striking place to begin with this conversation is in the production and the instrumentation, which in contrast to the more lush mixes that characterize Kaput or Poison Season, Ken is heading in a direction that many would deem darker. And when I say darker, while the guitar tones are rougher and the drum machines are more rigid and booming and the bass is more hollowed out and the synthesizers feel more alien, it never quite hits that point of true Gothic bleakness that characterized many of The Cure's albums that inspired this, and in a sense, that's kind of the point. If you pay attention to the production, it often has as much depth and space as Kaput and Poison Season did, but the air has changed somewhat for something that's a little bit more damp and clammy. Vocals that are close enough to imply intimacy in the mix, but a mix that's also cold enough to imply empty disconnection and alienation. Right from the beginning with songs like Sky's Gray, the fizzy beats at the base of the mix they skitter, and you can tell that the producer Josh Wells is toying with binaural progressions as the beat shifts from left to right to left again, and this is before the alien gurgles of synth come crashing through at the halfway point against the lingering guitar tones. These are songs that are designed to make the audience feel a little uneasy in a subtle, unsteady way, and yet more often than not, there is an unearthly sort of beauty to these tracks, as Dan Bejar's commitment to real melody always cuts through. The saxophone lines on Tinseltown Swimming in Blood and Rome and Ivory Coast, they might be weedy. The bells tolling through A Light Travels Down the Catwalk can be kind of discordant. The spikes of smoldering guitar on Covered from the Sun and Somewhere in the World, they might kind of warp and contort at points against the more steady and defined grooves. The synthesizers, they might shift into alien or atonal shifts all across the album, but there's an odd feeling of shimmering detachment element that blunts some of the rougher edges on this album. Empathetic and conscious, but never quite able to affect that change you might desire. So there is that feeling of detachment that runs through a lot of the production. It's all a little bit muffled, and yet you still get a lot of instrumental moments that I really love melodically along the way. Many of these songs are the shortest that Destroyer has ever delivered, but they don't waste their time. They bring a pretty potent energy to the grimier riff on In the Morning and Cover from the Sun and Sometimes in the World, or the thicker melodic bass and the noisier simmer of Rome or La Règle de Jeu, and then they have the acoustic touches on that last song and Saw You in the Hospital, and especially whenever those gorgeous high backing vocals come in at precisely the right time to emphasize that distant empathy separated by calamity or a border between them. It's just breathtaking every single time. And yeah, there's gonna be no way around this when we have to talk about the lyrics in depth. While Dan Bejar has shied away from saying that this album is explicitly political, it's hard not to read a lot of these tracks, especially La Règle de Jeu, which borrows its title from a French movie about a party that happens days before World War II, as a response tonally or an observation to the political climes that are south of the border, whereas we as Canadians are seeing the ever unfolding slow motion disaster, and yet unable to impact any sort of real change or consequence in this thing. But Dan Bejar is not one to immediately date his work with those sort of immediate, direct political references, and he's aiming for a remarkably focused yet higher concept here, exploring the emotional aftermath after such an event like what happened last year would be, with a particular focus on those artists who find their words now ringing a little bit hollow. As such, Destroyer just blows right past the disconnected platitudes of Katy Perry with songs like Chained to the Rhythm, or even what The National did on Sleep Well Beast, where it's clear that much of the trauma for them was still too near, with enough distance to truly take in the broader scope. It's one of the reasons why I made a comparison to Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds' epic 2013 track Higgs Boson Blues from Push the Sky Away, where a world is confronted with an advance in change in knowledge that most people couldn't possibly understand, and Nick Cave is just a witness to the trauma playing out around him in this now strange new world. And this is, incidentally, one of the reasons why I think that a lot of people have completely missed the mark on any sort of interpretations on this album, calling it scattershot, saying it doesn't make sense, or drawing comparisons to David Lynch, when, in reality, the marks of this trauma are all the more plain when placed in the right context. The artists that are hoping to spark a worldwide change love the imagery of a Death Star in bloom. So many great layers to that if you know your Star Wars. If they find themselves fading off the stage into the rhythm of the night on In the Morning, and that metaphor of harsh truth presented by that sun continues forward on Cover from the Sun. And then you have the moments where said figures must find some vestige of normal routine again. After all, the world isn't gonna stop turning. The boulevard of sinners is already filling up to watch you stride down that catwalk and strike an empty pose. Another great metaphor, as the art is never completely representative of the human truth in their art, but there is a fragment even when your heart's not really in it anymore, as it might be the case for some of these artists. It's also why I think any comparisons to Noir also completely miss the mark. This is not a record aiming for the slinky or sexy side of goth, but the bleak, numb reality that exists in time's passage, where one disappears into another's bed as a way just to escape the yawning of emptiness, doing what Romans do, to quote Rome, likely in the moments of empire before a coming fall, or beneath the Caligula archetype undeserving of the royal purple. And artists realize that they can't pay the price to save others or disrupt that system. All they have is money. That's not going to be enough to pay this price, and they remain cogs in the larger system. But even then, cogs can disrupt that machine, and Dan Bejar knows that. But if all of this, it feels a tad too detached, potentially lacking in empathy for those who will never have that power to respond and have already suffered and will become victims, well, Destroyer's already covered that too. Tinseltown Swimming in Blood might seem to fit in the same vein of In the Morning and castigating the plastic entertainment buckling under real trauma, really pointing the finger at those artists, but he also describes his dream in this verse. I had no feeling, I had no past. I was the Arctic, I was the vast, spaces without reprieve. Very Canadian metaphor, but an apt one. The disconnected creator writing poetry in the corner might contain multitudes, might have a vastness within himself, but nothing lives there. It's frigid, it's cold. And you can see him trying to extend some form of empathy on Saw You at the Hospital, staring into the glassy eyes of trauma that might seem rambling or deranged, while to him it's just a scene, to them it's all too real. It's also what makes Ivory Coast cut so deeply, taking the perspective of the old mercenary from the outside, the perpetually detached feeling that resonated so deeply and came across so often on whiteout conditions, and shows that quiet damnation to the one who is always on the outside and doesn't have to care. Great things might come to those who wait forever and never engage, but it's also greatness that will never actually come. So you have to wonder if Stay lost his message not just for the audience, but also for Dan Bejar himself, coming to acceptance with a discomfort and feeling of abandoned loneliness by engaging in that world, because on some level, it is all an illusion. Your name is already in the Book of the Dead, so why not stay on the streets for that living? A moment of consolation before he looks south again and sees those who are wasted and slightly blinded, with men described as vulgar pigs around them. A beautiful woman, but that man is not worthy, but not so blind as to not see. And as the cyclical nature emphasized throughout this album implies, eventually that vision, it'll become clear. You know, folks, as much as I have praised this album, and again, make no mistake, this is easily one of the best of 2017, it is a hard record for me to recommend because, again, it's not an album that's designed to console or incite righteous anger or even just wallow in abject nihilism. That'd be easy. If anything, it feels like the shock to the system that those artists who have been wallowing in the aftermath of 2016 desperately need, probably a little too late for them, that dissembles arrogance, rips apart blinders, and yet does it with the sort of quiet empathy that Dan Bejar has subtly mastered over the decades in order just to continue on. As such, it's not really designed to be a comfortable record. It's a shock to the system. But the complicated, realistic picture he paints can serve as an answer for those people with the long view in mind, at least if they're willing to take it. And if you can't tell, 9 out of 10, without question, absolutely a recommendation. Dan Bejar said this album was inspired by an era where music hit him like a sickness, with his definition of the word Ken coming from the original title The Suede song, The Wild Ones, and also meaning for him to know. With this record and Facing the Unknowable, I think Destroyer found answers that they, and we, can finally accept, and then move forward. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know I went into a lot of detail in here. This is a dense album, I think all Destroyer records are, even though this record was not as difficult to decode as Poison Season was, but still probably as good. So yeah, if you want to buy this, link is in the description below. Pick up this record. Records like this need to be heard. And at the same time, somebody buy a copy for Katy Perry and Matt Berninger. I think they could really appreciate it right now. But hey, if you guys got your opinion on this too, polls up there. I'm curious how many people will come down as strongly in favor of this record as I do, because again, critics have kind of not really known what to do with it, and I think that's a damn shame. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in supporting this channel or potentially impacting my schedule, a link to my Patreon is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to add records or even movies to that schedule. More details right over there. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.